"See you in the next life," my daughter-in-law said, locking me in the sinking boat. My son just stared. They left me to drown, held my funeral, and claimed my inheritance. But I survived. When I appeared in the middle of my own funeral, the look on their faces was priceless. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. But let me back up and tell you how I ended up fighting for my life in the middle of Lake Morrison at 2 a.m, watching my own family sail away while water rushed through the hull beneath my feet. It started 3 weeks earlier, on what should have been the happiest day of my life, my 70th birthday. I'd been looking forward to it for months, planning a small celebration with my son David and his wife Jessica. After losing my husband Frank 2 years ago, these family moments had become precious to me. I should have known something was wrong when Jessica insisted on having the party at their lake house instead of my home. "Mom, Eleanor," she'd said in that sweet voice that always made my skin crawl just a little. "You deserve to be pampered on your special day. Let us handle everything." David had nodded enthusiastically, his dark eyes bright with what I thought was affection. "Mom, you've done so much for us. It's time we returned the favor." And they had done so much for me, hadn't they? Moving in to help after Frank's death, managing my finances when I felt too overwhelmed to handle them myself, taking care of the house maintenance I couldn't manage alone. Such devoted children. The birthday dinner was perfect, I had to admit. Jessica had prepared all my favorites: pot roast with those little potatoes I loved, fresh green beans from the garden, and a chocolate cake that would have made Frank smile. We sat on their deck overlooking the lake, watching the sunset paint the water gold and red. "To Mom," David raised his wine glass, "the strongest woman I know." Jessica clinked her glass against his. "To family," she added, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. I should have paid attention to that smile. After 30 years as a high school principal, you'd think I would have developed better instincts for recognizing trouble. But grief does funny things to your judgment, and I was so hungry for their attention, so grateful to feel loved again. "I have something for you, Mom," David said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out an envelope, thick and official-looking. "We wanted to make this birthday extra special." Inside was a deed transfer. My house, the house Frank and I had bought as newlyweds, where I'd raised David, where every corner held 45 years of memories, now belonged to Jessica. "Sweetie, I don't understand," I said, my hands shaking as I read the document. "When did I sign this?" "Last month," Jessica said smoothly, "when you came over feeling so confused about those bank statements. Remember? We explained that it would be easier for me to handle your affairs, given your condition." My condition. That's what they'd started calling the moments when I felt overwhelmed by paperwork or forgot where I'd put my reading glasses. Normal signs of getting older that they'd somehow transformed into evidence of my incompetence. "But this is my home," I whispered. "And now it's safe," David said, his voice gentle but firm. "Mom, you've been struggling. The bills piling up, forgetting appointments. This way, you don't have to worry about anything." "What bills? I've never missed a payment in my life." They exchanged one of those looks, the kind that made me feel like I was watching a conversation I wasn't invited to join. "Mom," Jessica said carefully, "you've been sending checks to that charity scam again. The Children's Foundation that doesn't exist. You've donated over $15,000. I stared at her. I'd never heard of any children's foundation. I kept meticulous records of my charitable giving, had for decades. Frank used to tease me about my color-coded filing system, but the evidence was there in the bank statements they showed me. Check after check made out to organizations I didn't remember supporting, in amounts that made my pension disappear like water through a sieve. "The important thing," David said, taking my hand, "is that we caught it in time. Now everything's protected. Protected from me, apparently." That night, lying in the guest room of what used to be my house, I stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what had happened. The woman who'd run a school of 800 students, who'd balanced budgets and managed crises and commanded respect from teenagers and faculty alike, had somehow become too confused to manage her own affairs. But when morning came, and I couldn't find my purse or my cell phone, and Jessica explained that they'd be taking care of those things for me now, a cold certainty settled in my chest. This wasn't protection. This was a cage, and the lock had just turned. "We thought a nice boat ride would cheer you up," Jessica said 3 weeks later, her voice as bright as the morning sunshine reflecting off Lake Morrison. "You've seemed so down lately." Down. That was one way to describe the slow realization that my own son and daughter-in-law had systematically stripped away every aspect of my independence. My house, my bank accounts, my car keys, my phone, all removed for my own good, of course. I stood on the dock watching David untie the ropes from the marina cleats. Their boat, a 30-foot cabin cruiser they'd bought last summer with money they claimed came from David's promotion, bobbed gently in the morning swell. "I'm not really in the mood for a boat trip," I said, though I knew protest was useless. I'd learned over the past 3 weeks that my preferences no longer mattered much in this new arrangement. "Nonsense!" Jessica laughed, that musical sound that had once charmed me and now made my teeth ache. "Fresh air will do you wonders. Besides, we have something important to discuss with you." Something important. Those words never meant anything good anymore. I climbed aboard, accepting David's steadying hand, though every instinct told me to turn around and walk back to the car. But where would I go? The woman who'd been Eleanor Franklin, respected educator and homeowner, had somehow become Eleanor the confused elderly dependent, entirely reliant on the generosity of her caregivers. We motored out into the lake, the engine's steady rumble filling the silence between us. It was a beautiful morning, the kind Frank and I used to love. We talked about buying a boat when he retired, spending our golden years exploring all the lakes we'd never had time to visit. Instead, Frank died of a heart attack 2 weeks before retirement, and I spent my golden years signing papers I didn't understand and watching my life disappear piece by piece. "You know, Mom," David said as we reached the deeper water, "we've been thinking about your living situation." My living situation, as if I were a piece of furniture they needed to rearrange. "What about it?" I asked, though I suspected I didn't want to know the answer. Jessica joined us on the deck, carrying a manila folder that made my stomach clench. "Well, the house is quite large for one person, and maintaining it is expensive. We think it would be better if we sold it." "Sold it? But it's my home." "Technically," Jessica said with that patient smile, "it's my home now, and I found a lovely assisted living facility that would be perfect for you." She opened the folder and showed me glossy brochures for Sunset Manor, a place that looked more like a hospital than a home. All sterile hallways and communal dining rooms, and activities directors with forced smiles. "The best part," David added, "is that selling the house will provide enough money to pay for your care indefinitely. We've already spoken to the administrator." Already spoken to them. Past tense. Done deal. "When?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Next week," Jessica said cheerfully. "We've scheduled the tour for Monday, and you can move in Wednesday. It'll be like a fresh start." A fresh start. At 70 years old, in a place where strangers would monitor my medication and plan my daily activities and decide when I was tired enough to go to bed. I looked out at the water, watching the shoreline of my hometown grow smaller in the distance. Somewhere out there was the house where I'd brought David home from the hospital, where I'd nursed him through chicken pox and helped him with homework and watched him graduate with pride bursting from my chest. Now he sat across from me, calmly describing how he planned to erase the last trace of the life I'd built with his father. "There's one more thing," Jessica said, her voice taking on a different quality. Harder, less sweet. "The insurance policy Frank left you. We'll need to update the beneficiary information." "Why?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand. "Well, if something happens to you at the facility, it would be easier if David was already listed as the primary beneficiary. These things can be so complicated for grieving families. If something happens to me, not when, if." I watched my son's face as his wife spoke about my potential death with the same casual tone she'd used to discuss dinner plans. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before, something that made me realize I was looking at a stranger wearing my child's face. "I think I'd like to go back now," I said quietly. "Oh, we will," Jessica said, checking her watch. "But first, David wanted to show you something special. Didn't you, honey?" David nodded and disappeared below deck. When he returned, he was carrying a life jacket and a strange smile. "Put this on, Mom," he said, holding out the bright orange vest. "Safety first." I took the life jacket, noting that it felt oddly light. Too light. But I put it on anyway, because what else could I do? That's when I noticed we were much farther from shore than I'd realized, and the engine had stopped running. "The thing is, Mom," David said as he fastened the life jacket around me, his fingers working the buckles with practiced efficiency, "this whole situation has become rather complicated." I stood on the deck, the bright orange vest secure around my chest, watching Jessica disappear below deck again. The engine remained silent, and we bobbed in the middle of the lake like a cork, the shoreline a distant smudge of trees and buildings. "What situation?" I asked, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. Smaller somehow. "The financial situation," David said, sitting down on the bench across from me. "See, Mom, the house is worth more than we initially thought. A lot more. And your pension, plus Dad's life insurance, plus the investments you forgot you had. Well, it adds up to quite a substantial sum. Investments I forgot I had. Right. Just like the charitable donations I didn't remember making. Substantial enough," Jessica called from below, "to be worth a significant inheritance tax if it passes to the next generation naturally." Naturally. Such an interesting choice of words. "But if you were to pass away unexpectedly," David continued, his voice conversational, "before we have to move you to Sunset Manor and start paying those expensive care facility fees, well, that would solve several problems at once." I felt the blood drain from my face. "David, what are you saying?" "I'm saying," he said, standing up and moving toward the rail where Jessica had reappeared with a toolbox, "that loving children sometimes have to make difficult decisions for their parents' own good." The toolbox. I'd been so focused on the conversation that I hadn't noticed the sound of power tools coming from below deck, or the way the boat had started sitting lower in the water. "You see, Mom, we've discovered that this particular model of boat has a design flaw," Jessica said, opening the toolbox to reveal what looked like drill bits and saw blades. "The hull integrity can fail quite suddenly, especially in older vessels. Older vessels. Like older people, apparently dispensable when they become inconvenient." I watched in growing horror as David began untying a small inflatable raft from the storage compartment. The kind emergency raft designed for two people. 2 people exactly. "The Coast Guard investigation will show that you insisted on going below deck when you felt seasick," Jessica continued, pulling on work gloves. "Unfortunately, when the hull gave way, you were trapped in the cabin. David and I barely escaped in the emergency raft. A tragic accident," David added, testing the raft's inflation valve. "The kind of thing that happens to confused elderly people who wander around boats without supervision. They had it all planned out. Every detail, every explanation, every expression of grief they'd wear at my funeral. I wondered how long they'd been working on this plan. Had they discussed it over dinner while I sat in my former guest room? Had they practiced their shocked expressions in the mirror? The best part," Jessica said, and I realized she was actually enjoying this, "is that everyone already thinks you're losing your mental faculties. Who's going to question the story when the poor, confused old woman makes a fatal error in judgment?" I looked around the boat, noting details I'd missed before, the way certain safety equipment was missing from its usual locations, the fact that we were far enough from shore that no one would hear me scream, the realization that my life jacket felt wrong because they'd probably removed most of the flotation material. But here's the thing about being a high school principal for 30 years. You learn to stay calm in crisis situations. You learn to think clearly when teenagers are screaming and parents are threatening and school board members are demanding impossible solutions to impossible problems. And you learn that bullies always make the same mistake. They underestimate their victims. "There's just one problem with your plan," I said, my voice steady despite the terror coursing through my veins. "What's that, Mom?" David asked, his tone indulgent, like he was humoring a child. "You forgot about Mrs. Patterson." Jessica frowned. "Your neighbor? What about her?" "She saw me leave with you this morning," I said, which was true. "And she knows I didn't want to go on this boat trip because I told her so yesterday when she came over for coffee," which was not true, but they didn't know that. "She also knows," I continued, "about the documents you've been forging, because I gave her copies of everything before you took my keys away," which was definitely not true, but I could see doubt creeping into Jessica's expression. "You're lying," David said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "Am I?" I pulled off my wedding ring and held it up so they could see the inscription Frank had engraved inside the band 47 years ago. Mrs. Patterson has been taking pictures of every bruise, every cut, every time I've shown up at her door looking like I've been handled roughly. She's been documenting everything, just like I taught her when her grandson was being bullied at school. This was a complete fabrication, but it was working. I could see them exchanging glances, recalculating, wondering what else they might have overlooked. Even if that's true, Jessica said slowly, it doesn't matter. We're miles from shore. Your life jacket won't keep you afloat for more than an hour, and by the time anyone finds your body, we'll be back at the marina with witnesses who saw us return alone and devastated. She was right, of course, but she'd made one crucial error. She'd told me exactly how much time I had to work with. Water was seeping through the holes David and Jessica had drilled in the hull, and I could feel the boat settling lower with each passing minute. They'd inflated their emergency raft and were preparing to abandon ship, leaving me alone on what they intended to be my floating tomb. "One more thing, Mom," David said as he helped Jessica lower the raft into the water. "In case you're wondering, this isn't personal, it's just business." Business. My murder was just business. "Actually, it is a little personal," Jessica corrected, checking the emergency supplies in the raft. "You never liked me, Eleanor. You always thought David could do better." She was right about that, but I'd kept my opinions to myself. Apparently, my diplomatic silence hadn't been enough to save me from her resentment. "And frankly," she continued, "listening to your stories about the good old days and your perfect marriage to Frank was getting really tiresome. Some of us have real problems to deal with. Real problems like inheriting a fortune from a woman they'd murdered." My heart. They climbed down into the raft, and David looked up at me one last time. For just a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the boy I'd raised, the child who'd cried in my arms when he skinned his knee, who'd called me his best friend on Mother's Day cards made from construction paper and glitter. But then Jessica said, "Come on, honey. We need to get back before someone notices how long we've been gone." And the moment passed. "See you in the next life, Eleanor," Jessica called as they paddled away from the sinking boat. I watched them disappear into the morning mist, their voices carrying across the water as they discussed the timeline for reporting the accident and which expressions of grief would be most convincing. Then I was alone with the sound of water rushing through the hull and the very real possibility that I was about to die in the middle of Lake Morrison. But here's what my devoted family didn't know about me. I hadn't always been a high school principal. Before I married Frank and settled into a respectable life of education and community service, I'd been Eleanor McCarthy, and Eleanor McCarthy had spent 4 summers working as a lifeguard at Camp Wildwood. I could swim. I could swim very well. I could also tie knots, read water currents, and most importantly, I could think clearly under pressure. The first thing I did was assess my situation objectively. The boat was sinking, but slowly. I had maybe 20 minutes before it went under completely. My life jacket had been sabotaged, but not entirely. They'd left enough flotation material to make it look legitimate while ensuring it wouldn't keep me alive for long. But 20 minutes was more time than they'd intended to give me. I went below deck and found the emergency supplies they'd left behind: a waterproof flashlight, an emergency blanket, and a small container of drinking water. They'd probably forgotten these items in their excitement over the main event. I also found something even more valuable: David's cell phone, dropped behind the small galley table when he'd been preparing their escape raft. The phone was locked, but I knew David. He'd been using the same 4-digit code since high school, the year he graduated. Some things never change, even in murderers. I called 911 and gave them my location as precisely as I could, based on landmarks I could still see in the distance. Then I called Mrs. Patterson, my actual neighbor who actually had been taking note of my increasingly strange behavior over the past few weeks. "Eleanor, where are you calling from? I thought Jessica took your phone." "Mrs. Patterson, I need you to listen very carefully," I said, keeping my voice calm and clear. "I'm on David's boat in the middle of Lake Morrison. They drilled holes in the hull and left me here to drown. I need you to call the sheriff and tell them to arrest David and Jessica when they return to the marina." There was a moment of stunned silence before Mrs. Patterson said, "Those monsters. I knew something wasn't right when I saw them loading equipment into their car at 5 this morning. Are you safe?" "For now," I said, watching the water level rise around my ankles. But I need to get off this boat. I hung up and pocketed the phone. Then I went back on deck and made my second crucial decision. I wasn't going to wait for rescue. I took off the sabotaged life jacket and found a better option, a seat cushion that was designed to function as a flotation device. It wouldn't keep me comfortable, but it would keep me alive long enough to swim to shore. The water was cold when I lowered myself over the side, but not dangerously so. September in Minnesota meant the lake temperature was still tolerable, especially for someone who'd once completed a 2-mile swim across the entire width of Lake Wildwood on a dare. I began swimming toward shore with steady, efficient strokes, conserving my energy and focusing on my breathing. Behind me, I could hear the boat's final death throes as it settled into its watery grave. I thought about David and Jessica, probably pulling up to the marina right about now, preparing to call the authorities with their tragic news. I thought about the tears Jessica would cry for the cameras, and the way David would hold her as they described my final, confused decision to go below deck just as the hull failed. I thought about the funeral they'd planned, and the inheritance they'd celebrated, and the new life they'd imagined building on the foundation of my death, and I smiled. Because they were about to learn what every student who'd ever underestimated me had learned. Eleanor Franklin was much tougher than she looked. The shore was still a quarter-mile away when I heard the Coast Guard helicopter approaching. But I kept swimming, because I had plans for that helicopter, and for the very surprised expressions I was about to see at the marina. The Coast Guard helicopter spotted me about 50 yards from shore, just as I'd planned. The rescue swimmers pulled me from the water, wrapped me in thermal blankets, and kept asking if I was injured or in shock. "I'm fine," I told them, though my voice was hoarse from the cold and exertion. "But you need to get me to Morrison Marina immediately. There are 2 people there who just reported my death." The pilot radioed ahead, and by the time we landed at the marina, Sheriff Bradley and 3 of his deputies were already there, along with what appeared to be half the town. Word travels fast in small communities, especially when it involves boats sinking and elderly women dying tragically. I could see David and Jessica standing near the dock, surrounded by concerned neighbors and marina staff. Jessica was crying prettily into a handkerchief, while David spoke to a deputy in the low, broken tones of a grieving son. They looked up when the helicopter landed, probably expecting to see my body in a Coast Guard recovery bag. Instead, they saw me climbing out of the aircraft under my own power, dripping wet, but very much alive. The expression on Jessica's face was everything I'd hoped it would be, pure, undiluted horror. David went white as death and actually stumbled backward as if seeing a ghost, which, I suppose, from their perspective, he was. "David! Jessica!" I called out, walking toward them with the Coast Guard crew flanking me. "I'm so glad you made it back safely. I was worried about you when the boat started sinking." The crowd of onlookers fell silent, sensing that something wasn't quite right about this reunion. "Mom?" David's voice cracked on the word. "But how did you— We thought you were— drowned," I supplied helpfully. "Yes, I'm sure you did. But you forgot that I used to be a lifeguard. Funny how that works out." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his sharp eyes moving between the 3 of us. "Mrs. Franklin, your son and daughter-in-law just finished telling us about the terrible accident that claimed your life. They seemed quite certain you'd gone down with the boat." "How odd," I said, wringing water from my hair, "since they were the ones who drilled the holes in the hull and left me there to die." The gasp from the crowd was audible. Jessica made a choking sound and swayed as if she might faint. David opened and closed his mouth like a fish, but no words came out. That's impossible," Jessica finally managed. "Eleanor, you're confused. The trauma of nearly drowning has obviously affected your memory. We would never—" "You would, and you did," I interrupted, pulling David's cell phone from my waterproof pouch. "And fortunately, you left this behind. It contains a very interesting recording of our conversation right before you tried to murder me." I hadn't actually recorded anything, but they didn't know that. And in their panic, David's face told me everything the sheriff needed to know. "I think we need to continue this conversation at the station," Sheriff Bradley said, motioning to his deputies. "All 3 of you." "This is insane," Jessica said, her composure finally cracking completely. "She's a confused old woman who's been making up stories for weeks. We've been trying to take care of her, and she's obviously having some kind of breakdown. Mrs. Franklin, the sheriff said to me, would you be willing to submit to a medical evaluation to determine your mental competency? Absolutely, I said without hesitation. But first, I'd like you to examine the boat wreckage and compare the tool marks on those hull breaches to the equipment in David and Jessica's garage. I believe you'll find the drill bits match perfectly. This was a complete guess, but again, David's face confirmed I was right. I'd also like you to investigate the fraudulent documents they used to steal my house and the forged checks they used to empty my bank accounts and the lies they told my neighbors about my supposedly declining mental health. Sheriff Bradley was taking notes now, his expression growing more serious with each accusation. Most importantly, I continued, I'd like you to ask them how they plan to explain returning from a boat trip without the woman they claimed was confused and incapable of making good decisions. Because that seems like a rather large oversight in their story. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Jessica sobbing and David asking for a lawyer. As the deputies led them away, Mrs. Patterson pushed through the crowd and threw her arms around me. Eleanor Franklin, she said fiercely, you are the most impressive woman I've ever known. When you called and told me what they'd done, I thought for sure. Her voice broke. I know, I said, hugging her back. But here's the thing about underestimating people, Helen. It's always a mistake. As I watched the police cars drive away with my would-be murderers, I realized something profound had shifted inside me. For weeks, I'd felt powerless, confused, dependent. I'd started to believe their narrative about my declining abilities and questionable judgment. But floating in that lake, swimming for my life, I'd rediscovered something I'd forgotten. I was Eleanor Franklin, the woman who'd turned around a failing high school, who'd stood up to angry parents and incompetent administrators and teenage bullies for 3 decades. I was not a victim. I was not confused. I was not done fighting, and I had a funeral to cancel. The interrogation room at the sheriff's station felt like stepping back into my old principal's office, that familiar tension of watching guilty parties squirm under pressure while trying to maintain their innocence. Through the one-way glass, I watched Jessica break first. She'd been crying for 3 hours straight, mascara streaking down her cheeks like black tears, while she insisted this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Mrs. Franklin, Sheriff Bradley said, turning to me, we found the tools in their garage. Drill bits match perfectly. Just like you predicted. Of course they did. People who plan elaborate murders always keep the evidence around afterward, probably because they never expect their victims to survive and testify. There's something else, he continued, sliding a folder across the table. We pulled their financial records. This wasn't their first attempt at insurance fraud. I opened the folder and felt my blood run cold. David's previous wife, Sarah, had died in a car accident 2 years before he met Jessica. The insurance payout had been substantial, and the accident report noted some unusual circumstances that were never fully investigated. Sarah's car went off the same bridge where they told us you'd gotten confused and wandered into traffic, Sheriff Bradley said grimly. Different method, same result. 2 wives. David had killed 2 wives for money. There's more, the sheriff continued. Jessica's previous husband died in a boating accident in Florida 3 years ago. She collected a significant life insurance policy there too. I stared at the documents, feeling sick. I hadn't just been a victim. I'd been part of a pattern, a business model really. Find vulnerable targets, marry into their families, then arrange tragic accidents. How many others? I asked quietly. We're investigating. But Mrs. Franklin, what you did today, surviving their attempt and getting evidence, you may have saved other lives. Through the glass, I watched David pace his cell like a caged animal. When he finally looked up and saw me watching, his face twisted with rage. He mouthed words I couldn't hear, but his expression told me exactly what he was thinking. Good. Let him be angry. Angry people make mistakes. The door opened and District Attorney Patricia Wells joined us. I'd known Patricia since she was a mouthy teenager, challenging every rule at Franklin High. Now she was the most feared prosecutor in 3 counties. Eleanor, she said, embracing me warmly. When I heard what happened, I could hardly believe it. Though knowing you, I probably should have expected you'd find a way to swim out of this mess. Patricia, Please tell me you have enough to put them away forever. Attempted murder, fraud, conspiracy, and now we're looking at Sarah's death and Jessica's previous husband too. They're not going anywhere for a very long time. She paused. But there's something else you need to know. She handed me another file, this one thicker than the first. We found their computers. Eleanor, they've been planning this for over a year. They researched your finances, your medical history, even contacted Sunset Manor 6 months ago to reserve a room. 6 months ago, when I was still grieving Frank, still trusting them to help me navigate my new life alone. They'd been planning my murder while I was making them Sunday dinners and buying Christmas presents for the grandchildren I'd never had. They also researched the best ways to simulate dementia symptoms, Patricia continued. Drug interactions, environmental factors that could cause confusion and memory problems. Drug interactions? We found evidence they were slipping medication into your food. Low doses of prescription drugs that would cause exactly the symptoms they were describing to your neighbors. The forgetfulness, the confusion, the poor decision-making. No wonder I'd felt so foggy and uncertain these past few months. They hadn't just been stealing my money and my house. They'd been stealing my mind. There's something else, Sheriff Bradley said, looking uncomfortable. We need to ask about Frank's death. The room went silent. I felt the floor shift beneath me. Frank died of a heart attack, I said slowly. The doctor said it was consistent with a heart attack, Patricia corrected gently. But given what we now know about David and Jessica's methods, we'd like to request an exhumation order. The words hit me like a physical blow. Frank, my Frank, who'd never hurt anyone in his life, who'd loved David like his own son, who'd worked overtime for years to pay for David's college education. You think they killed him too? We think it's worth investigating, Sheriff Bradley said. The timeline fits. Frank died 2 weeks before retirement, when his pension would have become your primary income source. And David was the one who found him, remember? I did remember. David calling me at school, his voice broken with grief, telling me to come home immediately. Frank collapsed in the kitchen, David performing CPR until the ambulance arrived. David, who just happened to be visiting that morning for no particular reason. How long? I whispered. How long what? How long have they been murdering people for money? Patricia and Sheriff Bradley exchanged glances. We're still investigating, Patricia said carefully. But Mrs. Franklin, you may have uncovered one of the most sophisticated serial killing operations we've ever seen. Serial killers. My son was a serial killer, and I'd been his latest target. The door opened again, and Deputy Morrison stuck his head in. Sorry to interrupt, but Jessica's asking to make a deal. Says she has information about other victims. Other victims. More Sarahs, more Franks, more elderly people who'd trusted the wrong family members. I stood up, feeling every one of my 70 years. I want to hear what she has to say. Eleanor, you don't have to. Yes, I do, I interrupted. Those people died because I didn't see what was right in front of me. Frank died because I didn't protect him. The least I can do is make sure their families get justice too. Through the glass, I watched Jessica wipe her eyes and prepare to confess. She looked so young, so vulnerable. If I'd met her anywhere else, I would have thought she was someone's beloved daughter, maybe someone who'd made mistakes but deserved compassion. Instead, she was a monster who collected husbands and insurance policies like trophies. But here's what she didn't know about Eleanor Franklin. I'd spent 30 years dealing with manipulative teenagers who thought they could charm their way out of consequences. And I'd never met one yet who was smarter than me. We started small, Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper in the conference room. She'd agreed to cooperate in exchange for a plea deal that would keep her off death row, though she'd still spend the rest of her life in prison. I sat across from her, taking notes like I was grading papers. Old habits die hard. My first husband, Robert, was genuinely accidental, she continued. He had a heart condition, and when he died during an argument we were having, I realized how easy it would be to make these things look natural. An argument. She'd probably been screaming at him about money when his heart gave out, then realized she'd hit the lottery. David was different, she said, glancing nervously at the recording equipment. When I met him, he'd already figured out how to make Sarah's car accident look convincing. We bonded over our similar experiences. Patricia took notes while Sheriff Bradley operated the video camera. They wanted every word documented for the families of the other victims. "How did you choose your targets?" Patricia asked. Jessica's composure slipped for a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath the tears. "Lonely people, widows, widowers, people with money but no close family to ask questions. David was perfect because he had you." She looked at me with something that might have been admiration if it hadn't been so twisted. "You were the ideal setup, recent widow, substantial assets, starting to seem a little forgetful, and David had legitimate access to your finances because you trusted him." "How many others?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "6 confirmed," she said. "Maybe more. David kept records, but he was careful about it. 6 families destroyed. 6 funerals where murderers sat in the front row, accepting condolences and cashing insurance checks." "Tell us about Frank," Sheriff Bradley said. Jessica's face went blank. "What about him? Did David kill his stepfather?" "Frank wasn't supposed to die yet," she said, and the casual tone made my stomach turn. "David was planning to wait until after the retirement party, make it look like the stress of retirement triggered a heart attack. But Frank was asking too many questions about the charitable donations. The charitable donations that didn't exist. Frank had noticed the discrepancies in our bank statements before I did. David panicked and moved up the timeline," Jessica continued. "A small amount of the right medication in Frank's coffee combined with his existing heart condition. It looked completely natural. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles went white. Frank had died because he was trying to protect our savings from fraud. He died because he loved me enough to pay attention to details I'd been too trusting to notice." "Where are David's records?" Patricia asked. "Storage unit on Highway 9, Unit 847. The key is in his desk drawer at home." Jessica paused. "There's something else you should know. We weren't working alone." The room fell silent except for the hum of the recording equipment. "What do you mean?" Sheriff Bradley asked. "There's a network, people who specialize in this kind of thing. David found them online, in a private forum. They share techniques, target information, even help each other establish alibis. A network, a whole community of people who murdered their families for inheritance money. They call themselves the Family Planning Group," Jessica said, with a bitter laugh. "Like some sick joke. David was planning to recruit others, expand the operation." "How many people are in this network?" Patricia asked. "I don't know exactly. David said there were chapters in 12 states. Hundreds of members, maybe thousands. I thought about all the elderly people who died in accidents over the past few years. How many of those had been murders? How many families were walking around with blood on their hands and insurance money in their bank accounts? The forum moderator goes by the name Inheritance," Jessica continued. "Real name is Thomas Morrison. He lives in Chicago and has been running this operation for over a decade. Morrison, like the lake where they'd tried to kill me. David chose the lake as a tribute to him," Jessica said, noticing my reaction. "Thomas Morrison was his mentor, taught him how to make accidents look convincing." "We'll need access to the forum," Sheriff Bradley said. "David's password is Sarah 2019, Jessica replied. "The year he killed his first wife." The casual way she said it, like she was giving out a recipe for chocolate chip cookies, made me want to reach across the table and shake her until her teeth rattled. But I had a better idea. "Jessica," I said, leaning forward, "I want you to do something for me." She looked surprised. "What?" "I want you to contact this Thomas Morrison and tell him that the Eleanor Franklin operation was successful. Tell him David and you are ready for your next assignment." Patricia started to object, but I held up my hand. "You want to catch the whole network, don't you?" I continued. "Then we need to make them think they're safe, that their methods work, and their security hasn't been compromised." Jessica stared at me. "You want me to help you catch them?" "I want you to help me destroy them," I corrected. "Every last one of them. Because somewhere out there, there's another Eleanor Franklin sitting down to dinner with people who are planning to murder her. And maybe, if we move fast enough, we can save her." Sheriff Bradley and Patricia exchanged glances. It was a risky plan, but it was also the only way to reach the people at the top of this organization. "What's in it for me?" Jessica asked. I smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. "The satisfaction of knowing that when this is all over, you'll be the only member of the family planning group who's still breathing." It was a lie, of course. Jessica would spend the rest of her life in prison regardless. But she didn't need to know that. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, I'll do it. As we prepared to set up the undercover operation, I realized something had fundamentally changed inside me. 3 months ago, I'd been Eleanor Franklin, the grieving widow who just wanted to live quietly and trust the people who claimed to love her. Now I was Eleanor Franklin, the woman who was going to single-handedly bring down a network of family killers. And I was going to enjoy every minute of it. The storage unit David had rented was like stepping into the office of a meticulous accountant, if accountants specialized in murder instead of tax returns. Files organized alphabetically by victim's last name, photographs documenting each target's daily routine, insurance policies carefully highlighted to show payout amounts, even medical records obtained through methods I preferred not to think about. My God, Patricia breathed, opening a file labeled Franklin, Frank. Inside were photographs of Frank leaving the house, arriving at work, even sitting at our kitchen table drinking his morning coffee. They were watching him for months. I flipped through the Sarah file, seeing pictures of David's first wife going about her normal life, completely unaware that her husband was documenting her schedule for murder purposes. The final photographs showed her car, before and after the accident. "Look at this," Sheriff Bradley said, holding up a manila folder marked Future Targets. Inside were background checks on 12 different people, all elderly, all with substantial assets, all recently widowed, including Mrs. Patterson. "Helen," I whispered, staring at her photograph paperclipped to a financial summary. They'd been planning to expand their operation to include my neighbors, but the most chilling discovery was David's journal, written in his careful handwriting that I'd once been so proud of when he was in elementary school. "Subject shows decreased vigilance regarding financial matters," I read aloud from an entry dated 2 months after Frank's death. "Grief-related cognitive impairment creates optimal conditions for asset transfer manipulation." He'd been studying me like a laboratory specimen, documenting my grief responses to better exploit my vulnerability. "Here's the forum information," Deputy Morrison said, pulling out a laptop they'd found hidden in the back of the unit. "Password works. We're in." The Family Planning Group forum looked like any other online community, complete with member profiles and discussion threads. Except instead of sharing recipes or gardening tips, they were sharing murder techniques and target assessment strategies. "There are over 800 active members," Patricia said, scrolling through the member list. "This is bigger than we thought." I read over her shoulder, my blood pressure rising with each thread title. "Making accidents look natural. Insurance investigation avoidance. Ideal target demographics. Long-term poisoning strategies." This one, Sheriff Bradley pointed to a thread with over 200 replies. "New Member Orientation Guide. It's a step-by-step manual for murdering family members." We'd uncovered a university for serial killers, complete with mentorship programs and advanced courses in elder abuse and inheritance fraud. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mrs. Franklin, this is Thomas Morrison. Jessica told me about your unfortunate accident. I'd like to meet you to discuss your resurrection." I showed the message to Patricia. "He knows I'm alive." "Jessica," Sheriff Bradley called to the conference room where she was supposed to be setting up our undercover operation. "What did you tell Morrison?" She appeared in the doorway looking nervous. "Exactly what you told me to say, that the operation was successful and we were ready for the next assignment." "Then how does he know Eleanor survived?" Jessica's face went pale. I don't know. Maybe someone at the marina posted something online. You know how small towns are with gossip. Or maybe Jessica was playing both sides, hoping to earn points with her network by warning them about our investigation. Patricia was already on her phone, calling for additional security. "We need to assume Morrison knows everything. Eleanor, you're not safe here." "I'm not hiding from these people," I said firmly. "If Thomas Morrison wants to meet me, let's arrange a meeting." "Absolutely not," Sheriff Bradley said. "We're talking about the head of a murder network. He's killed dozens of people. And he'll kill dozens more if we don't stop him," I countered. "But right now, he's curious about how I survived. That curiosity is our advantage." I typed a response to Morrison's text. "Thomas, I'd be happy to meet. I have some questions about how David and Jessica's operation was supposed to work. The reply came back immediately. Pier 19, downtown Marina. Tonight at 10 p.m. Come alone. Patricia shook her head. We can't let you do this. You're not letting me do anything, I said, standing up and walking toward the door. I'm a grown woman making my own decisions, something I should have started doing a lot sooner. Eleanor, please. Patricia, I spent 30 years managing crisis situations with teenagers who thought they were smarter than everyone else. Thomas Morrison is just another teenage bully with better resources. That evening I stood on Pier 19, wearing a wire and waiting for the man who'd taught my son how to murder me. The lake was calm, moonlight reflecting off the water like scattered diamonds. Thomas Morrison was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of looking like a mastermind criminal, he appeared to be an ordinary man in his 60s, wearing a cardigan and walking with a slight limp. He could have been anyone's grandfather. Mrs. Franklin, he said, approaching with a warm smile. I have to say, I'm impressed. David said you were resourceful, but surviving that boat trick takes real skill. Years of lifeguard training, I said calmly. Funny how old skills come back when you need them. He chuckled. Indeed. You know, I've been in this business for 15 years, and I've never had a target not only survive, but actively pursue their would-be killers. It's fascinating. Business. He called murdering families a business. I'm curious about something, Thomas, I said. How did you know I was alive? His smile widened. Because I've been watching you for months, Eleanor. David was talented, but he was impatient. I prefer a more thorough approach. That's when I noticed the red laser dot dancing on my chest. You see, Thomas continued, David's mistake wasn't in the execution of your murder. His mistake was in not verifying your death before celebrating his success. The sniper was positioned somewhere behind me, probably on one of the boats moored in the harbor. But don't worry, Thomas said kindly. This will be much quicker than drowning, and much less traumatic for the witnesses who'll find your body tomorrow morning. That's when I smiled. Thomas, you made the same mistake David and Jessica made. What's that? You underestimated me. I raised my hand, and every light on every boat in the marina suddenly blazed to life as FBI agents emerged from their hiding places. The red dot on my chest disappeared as a SWAT team sniper took out Morrison's shooter. You see, I said as agents surrounded Morrison, when you've been a high school principal for 30 years, you learn to plan for every possible scenario, including the one where the master criminal thinks he's smarter than the retired educator. Thomas Morrison's face went from confident to terrified in the space of a heartbeat. Mrs. Franklin, he said as they cuffed him, you don't know what you've done. This organization is bigger than you can imagine. You'll never be safe. Maybe not, I agreed. But hundreds of potential victims will be, and that's more important than my safety. As they led him away, I thought about Frank, about Sarah, about all the other victims who'd trusted the wrong people and paid with their lives. Tomorrow, the FBI would begin arresting family planning group members across 12 states. The network that had operated in shadows for over a decade was about to be destroyed by one very angry principal who refused to become another statistic. But tonight, I was going home to my house, the one I'd taken back from Jessica, to sleep in my own bed for the first time in months, and I was going to sleep very, very well. 3 months later, I was testifying before a Senate subcommittee on elder abuse, explaining how a network of family killers had operated undetected for over a decade. Senator Williams, I said, looking directly at the committee chair, the family planning group succeeded because no one wanted to believe that children would murder their parents for money. We made it easy for them by dismissing signs of abuse as normal family stress. The hearing room was packed with families who'd lost loved ones to network members. Some had suspected murder, but couldn't prove it. Others were learning for the first time that their relatives had been killed rather than dying naturally. Mrs. Franklin, Senator Williams asked, in your opinion, how many victims were there nationally? Based on the evidence we've recovered, at least 400 confirmed murders over the past 10 years. Potentially twice that number when we include suspicious deaths that are still being investigated. 400 families destroyed by people they trusted most. The number was staggering, but it represented only the cases we could prove. And the financial losses? Over $60 million in stolen inheritances, insurance fraud, and asset theft. But the real cost can't be measured in money. During a break in the testimony, Patricia pulled me aside with disturbing news. Eleanor, We have a problem. 3 of the family planning group members we arrested were released on bail yesterday. What? How is that possible? Expensive lawyers and technicalities. They're arguing that the evidence from the forum was obtained illegally. Patricia looked exhausted. We might lose some of these cases. Which members? Thomas Morrison's lieutenants. Marcus Webb from Denver, Sarah Chen from Phoenix, and Jennifer Martinez from Dallas. They ran the 3 largest regional chapters. I felt a chill run down my spine. Where are they now? Unknown. They disappeared within hours of making bail. That afternoon, while reviewing my testimony notes in my hotel room, I received a call from an unknown number. Eleanor Franklin? The voice was electronically disguised. You've caused considerable disruption to our organization. I certainly hope so, I replied, signaling to Patricia to start tracing the call. You cost us millions of dollars and exposed years of careful work. That requires a response. Let me guess. You're going to threaten my life? The voice chuckled. Nothing so crude. We're going to do something much more creative. The line went dead. Within an hour, my phone was ringing with calls from neighbors, friends, and reporters. Someone had posted detailed information about my financial situation, medical records, daily routines, and home security system online. They've made you a target for every con artist and criminal in the country, Patricia said grimly. Your personal information is all over the dark web. But the real shock came that evening, when I returned home to find Mrs. Patterson in tears on her front porch. Eleanor? They took Charlie, she sobbed, referring to her 12-year-old grandson who lived with her. Took him where? I don't know. 2 men came to the door this afternoon saying they were from Child Protective Services. They had official-looking paperwork claiming I was an unfit guardian. They took Charlie and said they'd be in touch about when I could see him again. My blood ran cold. The family planning group had evolved beyond just murdering elderly family members. They'd started targeting the people who'd helped bring them down. Mrs. Patterson, those men weren't from CPS. They were kidnappers. What? But they had badges, official forms, all fake. This is retaliation for helping me survive their murder attempt. I called Patricia immediately. They've escalated. It's not just threats anymore. They're kidnapping family members of witnesses. We'll find Charlie, Patricia promised. But Eleanor, you need to disappear until we can arrest the remaining network members. They're clearly willing to hurt innocent people to get to you. I'm not disappearing, I said firmly. But I am going to end this. That night, I did something that would have horrified the old Eleanor Franklin. I contacted Thomas Morrison in federal custody and offered him a deal. Thomas, your organization is falling apart. Your lieutenants are desperate enough to kidnap children. That's going to bring heat you can't survive. What do you want? Eleanor, I want the location of every safe house, every planned operation, and every member still operating freely. In exchange, I'll testify that you cooperated with the investigation. And why would you do that? Because a 12-year-old boy's life is worth more than my revenge against you. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. They have contingency plans you don't know about, Eleanor. Burning down the network will be dangerous for everyone involved. More dangerous than letting them continue murdering families? Meet me tomorrow at the federal facility. I'll tell you everything I know. But Eleanor, once we start this, there's no going back. They'll never stop hunting you. Good, I said. I'm tired of running from bullies. The next morning, I walked into the federal detention center carrying a list of every family planning group member Thomas had identified, along with their current locations and planned operations. What I learned in that meeting would either save hundreds of lives or get me killed. But at 70 years old, having already survived 1 murder attempt and dismantled a national killing network, I was discovering that Eleanor Franklin was much braver than she'd ever imagined. 6 months later, I stood in the federal courthouse in Chicago watching Marcus Webb, the last of the family planning group leaders, receive a life sentence without parole. This concludes the largest elder abuse prosecution in United States history, Judge Harrison announced. 437 defendants convicted, over 600 victims identified, and an estimated 800 potential targets saved from harm. The courtroom erupted in applause from the families who'd attended every day of the trials. Some were celebrating justice for murdered loved ones. Others were grateful their elderly relatives had been saved from planned attacks. Charlie Patterson, now safely returned to his grandmother, waved at me from the gallery. The kidnappers had made the mistake of taking him to a safe house Thomas Morrison had revealed during our cooperation sessions. FBI agents found him within 48 hours, unharmed but angry enough to bite one of his captors. Mrs. Franklin, Judge Harrison continued, the court would like to recognize your extraordinary courage in exposing this criminal network. Without your survival and subsequent investigation, hundreds more innocent people would have died. I stood as the courtroom applauded again. 6 months ago, I'd been a confused widow who couldn't understand why her bank statements looked wrong. Today, I was the woman who'd brought down the most sophisticated family murder network in American history. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. The real victory was the phone call I'd received that morning from Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the geriatrician who was now treating me. Eleanor, I've finished reviewing all your medical tests from the past year. The cognitive issues you experienced were entirely due to the drugs David and Jessica were giving you. Your brain function is completely normal for a woman your age. Normal. I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't becoming confused and incompetent. I'd been systematically poisoned by people who wanted me to believe I was helpless. After the sentencing, Patricia and I walked to the parking garage together. So what's next for the famous Eleanor Franklin? She asked. Well, the book deal should cover my retirement expenses nicely, I said, and the movie rights will fund the foundation I'm starting. Foundation? The Frank and Eleanor Foundation for Elder Protection. We're going to teach families how to recognize financial abuse and provide legal support for elderly victims. Patricia smiled. Let me guess. You're going to be personally involved in every case. Someone has to. These criminals count on their victims being too ashamed or confused to fight back. But they've never dealt with a whole foundation full of angry grandmothers who know exactly how their games work. As we reached my car, Patricia handed me a final envelope. What's this? A letter from David. He wants to see you. I looked at the envelope without opening it. What does he want? Forgiveness, probably. Or maybe he wants to explain why he did it. I thought about the son I'd raised, the little boy who'd made Mother's Day cards and called me his best friend. Then I thought about the man who'd drilled holes in a boat hull and watched me struggle in the water while planning which restaurants he'd visit with my inheritance money. You know what the difference is between David and Thomas Morrison? I asked Patricia. What? Thomas Morrison was a stranger who chose to become evil. David was my child who chose to become a monster. That's actually worse. I tore up the envelope without reading it. Some people don't deserve forgiveness, Patricia. They deserve consequences. That evening, I sat in my reclaimed living room, surrounded by the belongings David and Jessica had inventoried for sale. My wedding photos were back on the mantel. Frank's chair sat in its proper place by the window. The house felt like home again. Mrs. Patterson knocked on the door, carrying a plate of cookies and a bottle of wine. Celebration dinner? She asked. Perfect, I said, letting her in. I was just thinking about how much has changed. We settled in the kitchen where it all started, where I'd first noticed the strange bank statements and Jessica's too convenient explanations. Do you ever regret fighting back? Mrs. Patterson asked. I considered the question while pouring wine. 6 months ago, I could have simply disappeared into Sunset Manor, let them steal everything Frank and I had worked for, and lived out my days in confused, medicated docility. Helen, do you know what I learned from all this? What? At 70 years old, I discovered I was much stronger than anyone ever gave me credit for, including me. I raised my wine glass in a toast. To Frank, who would be proud that I finally stopped letting people underestimate me. To all the victims who didn't survive to get justice, and to the fact that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. What is it then? I smiled, thinking about the Foundation's first case, a 75-year-old woman in Seattle whose son was trying to steal her retirement savings using methods remarkably similar to David and Jessica's playbook. Unlike me, she wouldn't have to figure out the game alone. The best revenge, I said, is making sure it never happens to anyone else. Outside, the lake where they'd tried to kill me reflected the moonlight like scattered stars. Tomorrow, I'd wake up in my own house, drive my own car, and manage my own money. I'd use Frank's life insurance, the money they'd killed him to steal, to protect other families from experiencing our tragedy. David and Jessica would spend the rest of their lives in prison, remembered only as cautionary tales about greed and betrayal. But Eleanor Franklin? Eleanor Franklin would be remembered as the woman who refused to be a victim, who turned her survival into salvation for others, and who proved that you're never too old to fight back against people who underestimate you. At 70 years old, I was just getting started. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.